Welcome everyone and thanks for joining. My name's Ollie Pinson-Roxburgh, the Managing Director at Bulletproof. I want to take you through this webinar, Hacked in Minutes. We stood up a honeypot system in order to bait some attackers to uncover really their processes and their approach to hacking a system so that we can explain it back to organizations to help them to understand a bit more about how an attacker operates. So why do we do it? First and foremost, we speak to a lot of organizations and they find it very difficult to understand why they might be a target. They don't think they've got interesting information, they don't think they've got particularly sensitive data, and they're sort of baffled as to why they might be somebody that an attacker might consider as a target. We wanted to demonstrate a typical hacker's approach. There's something called the kill chain, which I'll talk about, which is really how the attacker operates. We wanted to prove that that's generally what the attacker would do and to sort of look at the data in relation to an attack. We want to show how quickly a site could get hacked. Lots of organizations are automating building systems in cloud infrastructure and also in on-premise environments these days. It's very quick to build a system. We wanted to prove that it's also equally as quick to hack it if you're not configuring it in a secure way and then just sticking it out on the internet. We wanted to demonstrate the strengths and weaknesses of monitoring solutions of today to prove that some of the existing security technologies out there are always going to struggle with detecting these attacks, and especially in the modern day, and organizations will find it very difficult. So we're going to give you some recommended remediation, we're going to give you some suggestions of how to protect systems and how to monitor them more effectively as well. So what we did was we basically built our own custom system based on PHP, and we baited the attackers. We wanted them to try and target the system. We didn't really want to see opportunistic attacks. We wanted to see somebody actually target the system. So we made it simulate a real-world scenario. We didn't make it too easy to hack. We made it so that it has to have some sort of involvement from an individual or a hacker rather than just an automated tool. So we'll talk a bit more about that as we go through, but first let's talk about the difference between an opportunistic attack and a targeted attack. Opportunistic attackers generally operate by performing automated scans. They're essentially scanning the internet all the time, trying to find systems that have an existing, outdated, or vulnerable component that they know they can exploit. They want to be able to rinse and repeat their attacks. They don't want to have to reinvent the wheel each time. It needs to be very quick, it needs to be automated, and it's just about building a great big botnet. So adding as many systems as possible to their collection of servers they've hacked. General purpose at the moment is to then turn them into machines that can be used to do cryptocurrency mining, pooling all those resources to mine for cryptocurrency. Equally, we've seen them in the past being used for large-scale DDoS attacks. So both of those approaches require lots of assets, lots of systems that have been compromised to perform those sorts of outcomes. The opportunistic attacker doesn't often really care what he's hacking. It's all about just bringing on more machines. So it could be hosted in a cloud environment, it could be hosted on premise, it could be somebody's local machine, it could be internet connected camera, it could be anything. They don't really care. Targeted attackers, however, are very different. Their approach is more of a manual approach. It's about being stealthy. They want to really understand an organization. They want to do a lot of reconnaissance. They want to do a lot of digging on the internet, on their website of their targets. They maybe even want to do some local physical reconnaissance to try and find as much out about the organization they're targeting as possible. They will, of course, do some form of automated scanning. It's almost impossible to be able to find out what vulnerabilities exist on a system exclusively by doing manual assessments. So they will do some form of reconnaissance, but it'll be very targeted based on what they already know and the reconnaissance they've done on an environment. The victims, of course, will be deliberate. They will deliberately choose who they want to target. Now, what both of these attackers have in common is they will follow the same approach, which is really well documented in the kill chain, something that Lockheed Martin came up with. It's to talk to how it was originally written for malware, actually, how malware gets deployed, but it actually does really talk nicely about how an attacker operates. So the first thing they'll do is this reconnaissance phase. This is part of the preparation stage of an attack. This can range from hours hours to months, depending on the target, depending on the outcome the attacker wants to achieve out the back of the hack. They'll go through a process of building their tools. They'll be looking to identify vulnerabilities. They'll try and weaponize their attack. They'll build a payload. This is what the attacker wants to drop onto the systems once they are able to exploit the system. And then, of course, once they've exploited, they'll try and execute on their objective. So the preparation phase is all about being prepared for getting onto the system, and then what will they do when they get there. So as we walk through these phases, you can see that when we get to the intrusion phase, it seems strange because it's only a few seconds really. This is purely because of the fact that the attacker will have done a good amount of initial preparation during that preparation phase. They'll know exactly how they're going to exploit the vulnerability, and then of course they'll be looking to exploit it, and then they'll drop their payload onto the system. After that, it's all about installing additional tools. So in a lot of cases, when a system gets compromised, a website, for example, the attacker's first objective would be to get a web shell on it. That's an interface, web interface, that the attackers will allow them to use the tools of the web shell to do other functions, like things that the website wasn't originally designed for. So things like upload files, execute commands on the local system, basically anything that they may need in order to further attack the system, even read databases in some cases and get access to the database files. So once they're in, they install their additional tools they might need. They will initiate a command and control connection. This is about connecting it back to a central repository, a server, a service, something that they can then initiate further commands to the system, or equally to exfiltrate data through that command and control connection, or to pull down additional tools to the system they've compromised. They will likely look at a targeted environment. They'll likely look to laterally move, find other systems in the environment also to hack in order to gain additional machines to add to their pool of servers, or they might be in a situation where they haven't found the information they need from the system they've compromised, and thus they'll need to find another server they can get data from or achieve their final objective. The last thing, of course, is to perform their objective. The last kind of final action is to decide on what do they want to do. Do they want to exfiltrate large amounts of data? And again, it really depends on why the organization has been targeted in the first place. But clearly, the attacker will try to achieve their final objective once they're in. Okay, so let's have a look at some of the details of how we were hacked. So from our point of view, what happened? We were hacked, the system was targeted, it was hacked. The first thing we saw was a lot of scan activity. It was from a range of IP addresses, clearly reconnaissance activity to try and detect a vulnerability that they can exploit. The next part of it is where it really reduces the chance of an attacker being an automated bot that tries to exploit this system. This is that we created a database file which had actually an admin account details within the database file. It's unlikely that an automated tool would pick this up, but the idea was the attacker would find that file with the administration account, log into the CMS system, and which they would then find an upload page, which is where they can then exploit that system. This attacker actually tried to exploit the system but was unable to, and there's a good reason for that. We put a security control in place. It was horribly weak. It essentially was limited so that the attacker wasn't able to upload PHP files. The attacker was smart enough, and this is where we really wanted to focus on, right? It was about making sure that we had somebody which was actually targeting the system that knew what they were doing. They had to be smart enough to find a way around that control and finally upload their web shell, which they did. They uploaded a web shell, but we'll see in a moment, but they had very limited functionality once they were on. But the idea here was that they managed to get around the security control. They thought they thought about it. They changed their plan, and they managed to get into the system. And this is the key thing also to note, that from a penetration testing point of view, when you're testing your systems, you really should focus on having regular penetration testing, because the automated scanning systems don't really think outside the box. They will look for certain patterns, and if the patterns don't exist, the vulnerability doesn't exist. A penetration tester thinks outside the box. They'll find a way around, and they simulate what an attacker would do, and that's exactly what we've seen here. So the initial activity, very soon after we set up the system, we saw a huge amount of activity. I mean, this only happened over a couple of days. We wanted to make sure that it was realistic. So we didn't have our analysts monitoring this, our typical analysts that we have in our Security Operations Center monitoring this. We had somebody that was in our pen testing research team just keeping an eye on it once a day. They had to trawl through over 11,000 logs, which is a lot of activity to try and investigate. Most of the activity involved some form of reconnaissance activity, so just scanning as part of reconnaissance. The other activity we saw was really bots, so sort of just general bots hitting up our system. We saw the typical suspects, right? The usual suspects, the types of locations we'd expect attacks from. So places like Russia, China, America. These are all the typical ones you see in the press where they say, you know, is the US and China really the ones that are targeting us? It's hard to tell, right? It's very difficult to figure out attribution in these cases. It could be that it's compromised systems scanning us. It could be attackers scanning us. We don't know. The key thing here is that you can see that there was quite a lot of activity in the UK. I would expect that a lot of that activity from our logs was either from our own systems kind of monitoring them, but also there was some activity because the IP addresses were UK hosted, so there's a good chance that they were being scanned by bots local to our region. Now, the interesting thing here is the initial spike of activity. So you can see on the right-hand side, we actually have loads of IP addresses hitting up our sites, but they don't really register on the graph here, right? You can't even see them. They're tiny little blips on this register, on this graph, shall I say? And this is graphs over a very short period of time, right? This is only over a few days really that we saw this activity, but we saw a huge spike of activity. Now, this is the really interesting activity here, this big spike, which we started to investigate. It was around about 7,000 log messages in total that we'd have to trawl through to try and figure out what was going on at this time. Now, bear in mind that this system is not very busy. We are only seeing activity which is related to hacker activity. None of this is normal behavior. We don't have any users on this system. We don't really have anybody browsing the site. It's not associated with a domain name. It just is an IP address sitting out on the internet. We hadn't done anything to market it. We did literally nothing. We just turned it on with a default configuration with a website which we knew was exploitable. And we saw 7,000 requests from a very targeted IP address. Opportunistic attackers were dominating our data, right? We saw short spikes of reconnaissance activity throughout the whole period of the time, which was only over a few days. Mostly botnet sort of herders, I would imagine, that were trying to find additional systems to compromise. We've got some data to support it, which I'll show in a moment. And the key thing here is they really don't care. Just a reminder, they don't care what they're hacking. There was an increase in vulnerabilities detected between 2016 and 2017, and a large proportion of that seems to be down to the fact that there was a couple of botnet herders that were really trying to build a massive botnet that was able to do some really huge numbers around DDoS. Some DDoS attacks that we'd never seen the volume of denial of service ever before, and it almost seemed impossible. But it was because they were targeting PCs, internet-connected devices, like I said, IP cameras, internet-connected fridges, anything they could compromise that was fair game, because all they needed it to do was to point it at a particular site that they wanted to take down and just consume the bandwidth for that server. So anything was fair game. So here's some proof of that. The first few bits of this table here show that it's an activity of around about 4,000 messages alone, just in Arachne, which is a scanning tool to scan the application to try and identify potential vulnerabilities within the application itself. And then SQL map, which can be used for a few different things, but the key thing it's used for is for enumerating databases in order to give information about what they can get from the backend database through things like SQL injection. So it was a tool built to make it easier to perform SQL injection and not have to handcraft everything. And of course, SQL injection is a key hacker approach that hackers would use, as well as what we see a lot in misconfigured applications. Often the developers don't think about SQL injection, and it's a good way to get into a system. Now, the last one is really interesting. This is a really clear sign of reconnaissance activity for an automated tool. This is something that came out of a potential D-link vulnerability, which I'll talk about a little bit later on. The key thing here is that we're seeing this reconnaissance activity, which is the first stage of the kill chain, something that we obviously talked about at the very beginning. It's really key to understand what vulnerabilities might exist. You can try and go and exploit those. Automated scanning, all of it. So this is the D-link vulnerability I mentioned on the last slide. That last part where it showed the user registering being Gemini 2.0, that is something which we've seen in the past in the press. It was something that was showing as there's a D-link router out there that's got a few vulnerabilities on it which can lead to a full compromise of a network. And clearly the botnet herders were looking for these particular attacks or these particular vulnerabilities as soon as it came out. So as soon as this was known that there was a D-link vulnerability, the internet just lit up with these herders trying to find systems to compromise and take over networks. So it was a clear attempt at finding our system and trying to see if it had the D-link vulnerability so they could exploit it and add it to their network of compromised servers. Hackers, so essentially we're just trying to add our system to an initial botnet. We would imagine it wasn't successful because we weren't running D-link. The key thing here is that we were seeing these small blips of activity, and we missed these because we weren't really looking for this small activity. We were expecting to see some real compromises, but it's really interesting data because there's only 206 messages logged against our web application. So it's clearly a very quick scan of a system to try and see if it's vulnerable, and then just disappearing. We never saw it again, never saw the same IP address again. And now, are they really worth looking at, those small blips? Well, in theory, if it's a targeted attacker, it could be the early signs of the attacker performing some small amounts of reconnaissance, but trying to be stealthy about it. So we should definitely register this activity as something to add to a list of potential threats, something you might want to go back to if you're seeing other more targeted attacks going on. So keeping a regular view and retaining evidence of strange malicious activity is, of course, clearly something that benefits you later on. And this also could be that kind of indicator that this attack is something that may become something slightly larger. So this kind of small generation of activity could be to prove something out. You know, is there a vulnerability there? I've done my reconnaissance. I think they might be vulnerable to this. Actually, they're not. Or yes, they are. Okay, I'm going to go dark for a little bit and I'll come back in a few days' time so that they just don't spot me again. It only takes one successful vulnerability exploited to take down a full business. Of course, there's a lot of activity that needs to happen to escalate privileges. I'll talk about that in our example here as well. But generally speaking, that first initial vulnerability will get you in, and then you're in an area of trust, right? The systems are then expecting to allow connectivity from systems within your network unless you've got some very stringent security controls in place. So once you're kind of behind the initial defenses, often the security becomes more and more relaxed, and you have less controls in place, which means the attacker can potentially use that as leverage to find other systems to compromise. So again, more activity, these small blips, 207, another very small blip, never saw that IP address again, clearly a sign of just, are you there? What have you got for me? Is there any vulnerabilities I can exploit? No? Okay, well, I'll move on. But this is a really interesting part because we saw that initial 7,000 messages for this one IP address. We then saw 86 messages and requests to our website that were much more targeted. It looked to us, looking through the data, that this was the same attacker swapping IP addresses out. Another neat technique. Do all either kind of noisy activity on one IP address that's maybe known to be, or maybe not known, actually might be the better way of thinking about it really. If an environment isn't known on any intelligence lists, you've just compromised it, you do a lot of noisy activity, you try and find out what's going on, and then flip your IP address to something that is clearly not known on any lists, not something you've used before. So when you're a target attacker targeting a particular organization, they don't spot you, and it keeps you under the radar again. So this was clearly the signs of the attacker now trying to further exploit the system. Now they've got their plan in motion. Oops. So the first part is what did the attacker actually do? The first part was to inject a web shell. So they found their way through that CMS system. If you think back to the stages I talked about, first thing they'd have to do is log in as the admin, find the upload page, and we can see them getting onto the admin page of the CMS system in this line that we've put up here. This is why log management without a tool is very difficult, right? You've got to go through every one of these log lines and try and understand what's going on. And when you've got 7,000 of these and you're trying to get to the needle in the haystack, it's very difficult. And we almost we've used this a few times in my presentations. It's almost like a needle in a needle stack nowadays, because everything seems to be a priority and something you might want to investigate. It's about figuring out which one of those is more important than the other and prioritizing those, which is what we focused a lot in our SOC processes, is trying to find a way to identify how much of a priority this is and how to escalate risk for our customers rather than just giving them an alert, right? Helping them to weed through the noise. So as you can see here, we first signs of the admin login. The next thing we see is the attacker making a GET request to a shell.php thread page. They're not really being very stealthy here. You know, if we were looking for shell in our logs, we would probably spot this. But it's shell.php, and you'll see that the interesting thing about this is that it says PHP 3. So what we've done is we'd created this control in place that said that you can't upload PHP files, but all we did was checking to see if it was .php. We didn't check to see if it was anything else. And so the PHP application just went, oh, okay, it's not PHP. I'll allow you to upload it. It uploaded it in something that was public facing. We could then, the attacker could then go to the page, to the shell.php 3 page, and it would render the page, it would render the web shell. So the attacker was smart here. They managed to find their way around it. They managed to get to a point where they could actually get onto the shell. And then, of course, what would be their next stage? The next stage is to try and find additional users. They're trying to figure out whether they have the right rights to do what they need to do on the system, or whether they need to escalate their permissions to another system. And in order to do that, they have to know what users are on the website. So that's what they did next. They tried to find a way to figure out and enumerate new users. And then the last part you can see is they're actually trying to figure out who they are to decide on, okay, what's my next course of action? Do I maybe need to escalate my privilege to another user? But you can clearly see that they're using this web shell now to do all their malicious commands and to execute on what they need to do to try and compromise the system further. Now, what really could happen next? What could this web shell allow the attacker to do? At this stage, we shut things down, and the main reason for this is because we have no idea what the attacker might do next. The attacker might have initiated a command and control server. They could have used this machine to compromise other servers on the internet, which we didn't want to be party to. So the main thing would be that they would try to initiate a command and control connection. Generally speaking, they do this through creating a reverse shell. So they initiate a connection from inside out, because that's generally where you find that the security controls allow. So the connection would be allowed out to the command and control server. The next thing would be to, of course, use this system to access data on the server. There wasn't any data on the server in this case. Of course, it was just a dummy site. It was a honeypot. But that was probably what they would do next. We're seeing more and more, as I mentioned earlier on. We talk about this as well in our recently released security report, released it in January. We talk about this in our webinar. If you haven't seen it already, have a look at our webinar. We talk a lot about cryptocurrency mining. It's a big trend at the moment. Attackers are using these systems to monetize their attacks through doing things like cryptocurrency mining. We're not seeing as much ransomware. Like I say, go back and watch that webinar if you haven't seen it yet. And of course, the next thing would be to add that server to a botnet if it was a more automated or a more opportunistic attack, or if the site after they've targeted it they didn't find what they needed, or they didn't find anything of interest, they might then add it to their botnet for other to perform other actions. So clearly we weren't going to allow that to happen, so we took the system offline. So what can we do now to sort of protect ourselves and to sort of be able to protect the data that we have on our systems? So the first thing, of course, is that if we can spot the initial reconnaissance activity where the attackers might be trying to find vulnerabilities, we can either find the vulnerabilities that they found and remediate them faster, or we can look to block the initial reconnaissance activity to try and slow the attacker down. They're likely to change their IP addresses. They like to do all manner of things to get around our controls if they are truly targeted. But if we can slow them up a bit, if we can find a plan to maybe remediate some of those servers before they get attacked, it's a good opportunity for us to try and deal with the potential threat before it becomes something greater. The key thing here is that reconnaissance is happening all the time, as we've seen within these results. So it's a happy balance. You don't want to be trying to remediate every single reconnaissance activity, but clearly if we see them targeting systems that are critical or high risk, you want to try and do something about it. Logs will help you to detect this activity. If you're seeing strange admin account activity, of course, we saw that in our systems. It took us a while to do it because, like we said, we wanted to simulate really what happens in organizations. The average detection for a system that's been breached is 189 days. So we're very slow to detect, as in general, from a security standpoint as organizations. So we have to reduce the time to detection. And one of the key ways to do that is to look for suspicious user activity. Your admins are likely to be a target. Your users with high privileges are going to be a target, so you need to keep an eye on them. So spotting that web activity, there's things like user behavioral analysis that you can use to detect strange or anomalous activity that you can raise the alarm bells that you can then go and investigate. Again, logs will help with this. If you know that your admins aren't logging in and making changes all the time, seeing strange admin activity is a clear sign that something's up. Also, a good practice, of course, is to have a separate administrator account for admins than their normal user account, again, to limit the chance of them getting compromised and the attacker getting admin rights on a machine. Also, things like application firewalls, they look at the layer 7. They really they're able to see the web traffic. They're able to inspect the traffic even over encrypted channels, which allows you to get better visibility of what's going on and to spot application attacks. Some of the other things that help. So in our case, and this is the same is true of many of the forensics in cases that we look at, if the organization that had been compromised had a way to spot when the attacker initially dropped the web shell on, they could have remediated it much faster and potentially stopped the attacker from gaining full access to their systems and stealing data. So if you're monitoring for things like files being dropped, strange anomalies and configuration changes in your systems, it will give you a good opportunity to try and deal with the issue before it becomes before the attacker manages to actually execute on their goals and exfiltrate information. Also looking for privilege escalation. So it's clear also in logs when a administrator or a typical user is using their privileges. Logs generally say that special privileges are in use, or they see them switching to a different user in the system using sudo on Linux systems. So it's a good opportunity to just keep an eye on what's happening with your privileged users and to see if there's any strange activity there as well. The other thing, of course, is to verify whether the attacker is trying to find other systems in the network to try and hack. You can do this using things like IDS systems, using host intrusion detection systems, or even infrastructure logs from switches and network devices to try and spot the attacker trying to find other systems to attack. So getting early signs of lateral movement also helps to stem the problem, right? It helps to reduce the amount of systems that are involved in the hack. It reduces the opportunity for the attacker to come across sensitive information, and of course it means that you can clean up a lot quicker if you do suspect a breach, and it also gives you a good understanding of what's going on in your network in general, which helps you to baseline normal activity. So to wrap this up in a quick conclusion, our honeypot really showed us a few things: that everyone's a target, regardless of where they're hosting, what they're hosting, and why they might be hosting stuff on the internet. The hacker generally starts with a huge amount of automation, so looking out for automated scanning activities will help you to spot attacks as soon as possible. Your business becomes a target as soon as you go live with those services. Like we said, we only spun these things up over a couple of days, and almost as soon as we put this system online, it was being targeted by something, whether that's an automated scanner or attacker spotting for his next system. The attackers are always trawling the internet trying to find stuff to target. And the attackers will still look to put together these large botnets because that's the way they monetize, right? They're turning into a business, or they have been turning into a business for many years. They're using these systems, they're using all these resources to sell access to their botnets in a lot of cases as a managed service. They provide 24/7 support for them. If your DDoS attack is not working, they'll help you to ensure that happens. And they provide you access as a pay-as-you-go service to allow you access to be able to use their botnets. So it's in their best interest to add as many systems as possible to their big set or network of systems that they've compromised. So I thought I'd talk a bit about benefits of SIEM, because clearly, as we mentioned here, just trawling through those logs and trying to pick through each log one by one is not exactly an easy thing to do. So in order to spot attacks, you need something that's going to help raise that to your attention. And SIEM technologies have been good at that for many years. The challenge with SIEM technologies is they're very difficult to deploy and get working properly. So I've seen a lot of failed deployments of SIEM technologies, sometimes because the technology itself is oversold. It professes to be something that's all magical and is going to raise all these events with you and get you the early detection. And often what you find is that there is limited device support. The correlations that are in there are only supporting certain systems, and so they don't raise many alerts. If they do raise alerts, there's lots of them and they're difficult to understand still, because they're still telling you very complicated alerting, not necessarily giving you an outcome, not telling you what you should do about these systems, just telling you there's a problem. You still have to go and investigate it. You have to be a SIEM expert, you have to be trained, you have to do all this work. So it's a bit of a challenging solution to manage and to get really working properly. But it should, of course, alert you to things that you need to see early on in the system. One of the things that the SIEM technology helps you with, of course, is to detect where the attacks are really coming from, to help you pinpoint where the threats are. And it does help you to whittle down the information to something that's more interesting, because you can filter out logs. There is that concept, of course, and the benefits of it providing this one place to go to filter all your logs, to look at certain time frames, and to have the data all in the same format, so you can search for IP address or host name. So there's all those benefits of identifying where the attack's coming from and help to target what you may need to search for next, what other systems might have been hit during an attack. So very beneficial from that point of view. It helps the organization to really see which systems are being targeted, to focus on the high volume of activity on a particular host will help you to detect whether that is a big target or not. It also helps you to focus on systems that might not necessarily need to be externally facing or need to be a target, because they can actually be brought inside of your organization without being provided as an external resource. It also helps following a breach as well, because of course you can be used in forensics to try and investigate where was the initial sign of attack, to try and filter back all the data to just focus in on where the key information is that will help you to pinpoint what the likely risk is to the business and what potentially has been lost during the breach, provided all the right logging levels are turned on the systems and the SIEM technology actually has the right log data. That's always another challenge as well, is that if you haven't set the right logging levels, you don't have the right information, you might not be able to detect the threat. So being clear on what you're looking for and not logging necessarily everything, because often you get alert fatigue and it could lead to you actually just missing stuff. So focus on those things that you know are bad, focus on those things that you know you would do something about, and the rest of the information is nice to have because it's interesting information that might help you to identify additional parts of what's happened during the attack. But generally speaking, really focus on those things you know that would suggest bad activity. So what's the problem with the SIEM technology? I've kind of talked a lot about them already. This kind of alert fatigue concept, right? If it's not managed correctly, all you're going to get is a load of alerts that tell you bad stuff's going on. And by the end of page 2, you're thinking this tool is rubbish and I'm actually getting no value from it at all. And I don't know what one of these things is really bad and which one I should focus on. The fine-tuning of the software can be pretty lengthy. Things are always changing in your environment. Threats are always changing. So logging and, of course, your ability to detect threats equally has to change at the same pace. So you have to keep adding new devices to your SIEM technology to make sure you're seeing the right data, you're getting good coverage. You also need to make sure that the system's logs are adequately tuned or filtered out with SIEM technology so you don't get this alert fatigue. You need a robust SOC process, which is quite expensive. And like I said, there's not only the tuning, there's also every day you should be looking at your logs to see if there's bad stuff going on. You need to be doing it almost in real time. Of course, for providers like Bulletproof, of course, we focus on that. That's what we do, right? We provide 24/7 SOC services, and we spend a lot of time focusing on customers' environment, getting to really understand them, making sure that we've got a robust process in place to detect the latest threats, to tune out noise, and to help to organizations to get an outcome, to understand really what they can do to remediate, not just get alerted to it. So you have to have that, and it's quite expensive to maintain that, the team, to train them, and all that good stuff. And it really only works if you are doing that consistently. You need to be watching your logs all the time. Like I mentioned, we wouldn't have spotted that attack had we have not have been just trawling through these logs and obviously trying to pinpoint the particular threat. And also, if the logs weren't jammed full of legitimate log data as well, there's a good chance we would have missed it. Because again, we weren't using any SIEM technologies, we weren't using any tools, we were just looking through the logs each day. 7,000, 11,000 logs is a lot of data to try and trawl through. So monitoring is critical. We have to make sure that the systems are properly configured. This hack really could have been prevented if we'd have known what was going on, because we could have seen them log in as the admin, we could have shut that account down as soon as possible. We should be looking to do some form of threat hunting. Now, this is a big term at the moment in the security industry, and we're talking a lot about threat hunting, because at the moment we've got pretty good security technologies that are out there that are able to detect known bad activities. The challenging thing is looking for the suspicious activity, the unknown activity, the types of stuff that it kind of looks suspicious, but we don't really know whether it really is. It's not obviously a suspicious activity. It's not something that's been brought up by a security tool. We also want to be going and looking for the latest signs of attackers targeting specific vulnerabilities. And what I mean by that is when a new vulnerability comes out, the first thing attackers go out to do is to try and find out if there's a way to exploit that vulnerability. And if they can build exploit code, they will then go and find the systems to try and hack them. What the defenders need to do is to go and hunt for that activity, to try and look for the attackers targeting that particular vulnerability, to go and find new ways to detect how the attackers might target that particular system, how they exploit it, in order to go and search for that in your log data and in your security tools logs. Pairing that with some form of automated monitoring, so default correlations that fire based on some set criteria, machine learning, all this sort of stuff helps to bubble up interesting information. But clearly, from a threat hunting standpoint, it's all about looking for the latest attacks to try and build hypotheses that try and spot that activity before it becomes a problem within an organization. Of course, machine learning is very helpful. It is helping to whittle down that data, to cut down the amount of false positives. It's helping to free up analyst time to go and hunt more stuff, to go and look for more of these more sophisticated attacks, to do more threat hunting. But it is also an ongoing job of helping to make sure that the machine is learning properly. It really has to be trained properly, and it requires continual input, requires continual tuning, not something that you can do once a year. And it's really down to the people at the end of the day. Alerts are really useless unless you've got somebody reacting to it, both internally and also somebody who understands what they're looking at. They know what the threat is. They know what the alert is telling them. They can escalate it with a recommended remediation. Hackers are thinking creatively, so we need to make sure that security software does the same thing. And at the moment, the old legacy approach from a security standpoint isn't thinking like that. It still requires people that think like an attacker, that can understand what's going on in these logs to really make some sense of it, to then decide on what's the best course of action, and how do we prioritize these events. And from a correlation standpoint, they're still going to be better than trying to build a correlation that's going to spot all this behavior and activity, because again, like I said, things are changing in our environments all the time. We're adding new devices, we're adding new logs. Sometimes these correlations fail because of that reason. They're just not being provided the right log data, and they're not getting the right information from the systems, and so the correlations don't really tell us anything, or they tell us too much. Prioritization is key. I can't emphasize that enough. When you're running around and there's lots of activity going on in your environment, and you need to focus on which part do I care about first, you really need somebody that can help you decide how to prioritize which one is the most important thing to deal with. You don't want to be wasting all your time looking at reconnaissance activity if somebody's trying to brute force your system on the back end, and you know that the root account's likely to be compromised because you forgot to set a strong password on the root account, or you didn't disable root logins for remote systems and administrator access. So you really want to be able to prioritize the right activities and make sure you're doing the right things at the right times, rather than focusing on old stuff or uninteresting or noise in your environment. Building a SOC. So this is the kind of the benefits of outsourcing, really. Building a SOC in-house is, as I've already mentioned, a bit of a headache. And so outsourcing is a benefit because, of course, you get the benefit of not only a load of analysts that are experienced and they know what they're doing with log data, you also get the benefit of an organization that's seeing attacks from lots of different fronts, lots of different types of organizations being targeted. You're already, as an organization like ourselves, we're getting a lot of intelligence about what organizations are being targeted in other areas, and so we can use that intelligence that we've gathered from other systems being targeted in order to be able to provide that early warning signal to other customers in the same space. You get access 24/7, right? It doesn't mean you have to have lots of staff on your books. If your staff go off sick and you may have only one IT guy that's your security professional as well, you've got 24/7 experienced staff that are backing you up, that are an extension of your security team, or should become an extension of your security team. Outsourcing the SIEM side of things means that you also have the benefit of this additional threat data. The learning of more information builds additional threat data, adds additional intelligence into systems that you wouldn't have to manage yourself, right? You don't have to worry about how do I ingest new intel, how do I learn about these new threats, how do I make sure that I'm doing threat hunting based on the latest vulnerabilities that have been seen out there, the latest intelligence. It frees up your staff, right? It gives them more time to go and investigate other things that they can do in the business, look at other security initiatives, or go and focus on their day job if they're not a security guy as their day job. So that, I thought I'd wrap up really, just to give you an idea of what Bulletproof do. We do loads of different things around the security space. We really do look to extend customer security teams. We provide lots of services in lots of different areas, and all of them sort of complement a very strong security approach. And we really are an organization that looks to become a very joined up and integrated part of an organization's security team. So I thank you very much for joining our webinar, and I look forward to seeing you on the next one. Thanks very much.